Hello. Hello, everybody. How are you doing this morning? Good. Okay, we're going to start. So I'm really honored this morning to introduce somebody whose work I really, really admire. Zara Slattery is an award-winning illustrator, comics artist, and tutor, and a painter, and a newly minted animator. Her animations are fairly impressive, very impressive. She's the author of the award-winning graphic memoir, Coma. She's an artist and contributor to academic resources anthologies, including Inking Woman, Wow Bagger Productions' Planet Devok, and Mivan Tristram's Draw the Line, and small press titles. Zara runs workshops and creates accessible guides to comic creation. She's a steering committee member of the Society of Authors Comic Creators Network and one of the directors of the recently formed Comics Cultural Impact Collective. She's currently working towards better access communications for mobility impaired creators and audiences at comic events across the UK. And I've known Zara for about sort of 7 or 8 years, and we share a publisher. And when I first met Zara and she showed me what she was then was a work in progress, which was Coma, I can honestly say I was kind of completely blown away by it. I thought it was one of the most kind of incredibly beautiful and kind of intriguing works I'd ever seen. And I was so amazed by it when it came out. And it's one of the books that, it's right up there for me in the sort of field of graphic medicine. It's incredible. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Zara for her talk this morning. Over to you, Zara.
Ooh, hello. Hi everyone. I'm just want to say how delighted I am to have been invited to talk to you. I want to thank Ian and Jane and Claude, especially for kind of like helping me out and sorting me around the place. So that's just brilliant. I'm going to invite you into some of the story worlds of a couple of projects I've worked on and I'm working on. What connects them is the medieval. But before I do that, I just want to kind of share with you some of the tools and methods I use to communicate. So I teach adults how to draw and paint, and the first thing I introduce them to is the drawing tool. And you'll see here I've got a red pencil. I've got one of my little stubby red pencils here. And it's got a really sharp point. So it's not just the pencil, it's the pencil sharpener. And I have used a lot of pencil sharpeners. I can recommend this wonderful little nugget of bronze here. And the reason why I draw or teach with a colored pencil is because it is colorful, because it sort of like opens up. We sort of think about drawing, we think about graphite pencils. But for me, they're kind of like, they're about a tool, they're a kind of like tonal tool, but also they're about right and wrong and correction. Whereas a colored pencil is just kind of like opening you up, and it sort of like makes you want to explore. And we have this fine point because when we touch the paper, it's the smallest point. So it frees us up to kind of like make marks and flow on the paper without making too much of an indentation, too much of a harsh tram line. So we can just control ourselves and just be quite fluid and free. So it's the red pencil, it's a sharp red pencil. Honestly though, if other people want to use a different color, if that's what makes them feel good, that's what they're invited to do. And one of the first things we do when we're drawing, when we're doing observational drawing, is we draw the apple. So I've got a sort of like a little, in case you wasn't sure what an apple looked like. There's an apple. Now this is kind of like brilliant because we have an idea in our head what an apple looks like, this quite simple form, but it's beautifully nuanced. You kind of like look at all the angles on it. So the first thing we do is we look. To look properly, we half close our eyes, which seems like an oxymoron. But that just enables us to cut out all the other visual noise. So whether we're just going to focus on shape or tone, in that given moment, that's what we're looking at. And then we take our pencil and we sort of like, we can ghost walk the shape and we mimic the shape. And we're just kind of like loosely moving. And if you're right-handed, you'll probably realize that you tend to go from right to left. Or if you're left-handed, you go left to right. So in my class, I teach people this sort of circling method. So I ask them to go in reverse, to not only stay around the perimeter of the object, but to move in different directions, move from left to right, move from top to bottom, move around. And it allows us to imbue 3D from the get-go. And I love the theme of this talk, because it being magic, because when I teach, I tell my students that drawing is smoke and mirrors. That's what it is. We're creating an illusion of 3D in a two-dimensional space. So this circling method just gives us the fluidity to move around. And we're not thinking about right or wrong. We're thinking of it like a piece of clay that we can pull and push. And when we've got our heads around the apple, we move on to the pear with its different planes. And I invite people to think about themselves as cartographers, as map makers. They're telling the story of the object and they're traveling around the object. So it's really faint, but you might be able to see there's kind of like circles in the body of the drawing that are just kind of like giving little bits of information about the different planes that are happening there. And then we use angles to determine distance as well. And when we've done the drawing, we think about the other tools and the brushes. And here actually a really good friend of mine said that you paint with a pencil and you draw with a brush. And it does something to your thinking about what you can do with these tools and how you can move them and how you can sort of like have this fluidity with the pencil and this mark making with a brush. And here I've got the flat brush, which is wonderful, sort of like for literally broad strokes. So we think about kind of like broad movements. And then it has a fine end, so it's a really versatile tool. And we have the round brush, which really holds lots of paint. So you can, again, move that, really kind of like let it splay, and it has a fine point as well. So you're always thinking about the weight of the paint and how you can move it, dispense it from the brush to the paper. And when we've thought about how the brushes feel and how they move, we think about the paint. And this is watercolor, and this method is wet on dry. And wet on dry is fantastic for contrast, for having clean edges. And it's really kind of, lots of people want to rush to the end, but when I teach my students about painting, it's about the process. It's about mixing the dilute. If you mix the dilute, you can control the paint, and you can load your brush, and you can take off the excess of the brush, and you can feel each process, and you can lay the paint on the paper, let it dry. It's about patience. We literally do wait for paint to dry, and then you can do another layer, let it dry, and another layer, and you can build deep color, and you can build tone, and you can draw with it. So you can see here, these are paintings of shells, and you can see the process from the drawing through to the line, through to the painting, and I'm here drawing and layering with the paint. And when we've done wet on dry, we do wet on wet, which is fantastic for diffused edges. Wonderful for atmosphere, wonderful for depth, wonderful for distance, and for blemished pairs. We can create sort of ombre effects, and then we can also add color whilst keeping the integrity of the other color. We can add it and just gently squeeze it in. Not everything is a brush stroke. Sometimes it's just gently dropping in and just, again, feeling the brush. And we're nothing without line. And I love the musicality of line. I got told when I was about 10 that I had no rhythm. And I'm really stuck with me. And then I realized that actually in drawing, I absolutely have rhythm, and I absolutely have music within me. And it's in the flow, and it's in the rhythm, and it's in the beat of my marks. Drawing is how we travel across the paper as well. And here I've got examples of abstract mark making, is what I refer to it in my classes. And here it's got straight lines in a natural environment and cross-hatching. So people automatically, when they pick up a pen in my class, want to go to cross-hatching, but think about the purpose of the cross-hatching. And here it's about creating tone again. And then there's natural mark making. And again, there's sort of like when lots of people say, oh no, I can't draw. But if you can describe something, if you have language, then you can draw. So lots of natural mark making refers to how things move, or the form, or the description of it. How does it grow? And then if you can describe it, then you can usually make a movement for it. And if you can make a movement, you can put a pencil in your hand and you can mimic that movement. So tall grass or a tree might grow, and you can start from the roots and you can build it up and you can feel it. So it's, a lot of the time it's about giving yourself permission to move and to move on the paper. And that's why I start with a red pencil, because it's about opening ourselves up instead of just trying to get it right from the get-go. It's all about exploration. So line was really, really important in the next project I'm going to talk about, which is coma. So coma I first presented here as an idea at Graphic Medicine in 2016. And then I came again in 2019, and I just had an introduction. And now I completed it in 2021. And it documents my 2 weeks in an induced coma and the hallucinations I had when I became ill, and then the ICU delirium in the coma. So I had strep throat that developed into necrotizing myositis. Yeah, and this documents that thing. And I lost my leg as a consequence. So this is where line is really, really important to the storytelling. So there are two concurrent narratives that run through coma. First is my husband's diary. I always tell people he's not a natural diary writer. It's not what he does, but a friend invited him to do that when he was sitting at my bedside, just as a brain dump at the end of the day so he could make sense of what was actually happening. And he wrote it for himself, but also for me, should I come out of it, just to make sense of what happened. And honestly, it was an absolute gift. So I wrote or drew his pages in charcoal pencil. And it took a while to find the right medium to kind of like tell his story. And charcoal was the perfect one because it's quite a primitive tool. It's sort of like, it's beautiful. It kind of like crackles on the paper. It holds emotion. And it was absolutely my route in. And also it's line drawing because this is the modern world. There are cars, there are buildings, there's machinery. And I just was thinking, I have to finish this graphic. So I kept it simple line, but that sort of also holds the kind of like the simple elegance of his writing. The hallucinations, the delirium I depict in pen and wash, because this is diffuse. There aren't real edges. It was a kind of potentially a dream-like experience, but it wasn't. It was a real experience, but sometimes the edges were unclear. So it was really, really important that I actually told this story, primarily for myself. I had to understand it. So when I woke up from the coma, I felt that nothing had prepared me for what I just experienced. There was no blueprint in my life, in my childhood, in my young adult life, in my approaching middle age, for what I'd experienced. In working through this process, I realized that there is an absolute blueprint, and it's in our stories. We have evolved with near death and illness, and we share the stories, and it's woven into our language. It's in our physiology. So I'm just going to go a little bit through the process. My first hallucination was a medieval skeleton, which I kind of like at first thought was really quite curious and amusing. That's before fear really, really kicked in, and I lost my sort of like my real sense of self. So I spent quite a lot of time drawing. There was a point when my emotional self was actually in the driving seat, and I had to get to a point where my creative self was actually controlling things. So I spent quite a long time just playing with ideas and playing with the borders. I was kind of like tinkering around the edges. And then I was kind of like thinking about the characters that I was going to be portraying in this story. And I spent an awful lot of time drawing and redrawing, and I thought, oh goodness, I'm just going to make these little models of all of us. There's sort of like me, my husband, my children, and some of the key characters that are in there. So I was able to keep a continuity, and also I could have light sources, so I could kind of like play with the light, but also I could just tilt the head, and I'd be, oh, I've got perfect panel potential. But the thing that emerged that I actually hadn't anticipated was the separation from me and the story. I was able to tell their story, these little character stories. It actually just freed me up a little bit. It sort of like took the chains away, so I could just kind of like pick up these characters and I was talking about them, even though they had our names. So I worked through both Dan's diary. I have to say, for about the first 4 years, I couldn't read it without sobbing. I couldn't hold it. My memory was absolutely fried. So sometimes I'd read it and I'd be like I was reading it anew. And I didn't first read it until about a year after the events. And then by the time I'm putting post-it notes in, I'm just leafing through. I'm feeling nothing. I've kind of like worked through the whole thing. And I'm just looking for page breaks. And I have my patient diary as well, which is what the nurses kind of like started. They started it about 3 days after I woke up from the coma, just explaining what happened to me. So the yellow post-its are the initial thumbnails of Dan's story. And they're really, really kind of like really rough. And then I sort of like developed those thumbnails, and I kind of like color-coded everything. So everything that was Dan's story was thumbnailed in blue, and then all of the coma experience was thumbnailed in red. And I didn't have prose for that, so I just listed everything that I could remember, and then I just worked through it in drawing. And I have to say, with Dan's diary, obviously it was just all narration, but I was able to go and speak to people that he'd mentioned and just have a conversation with them and said, so it says here that you brought lasagna around, and people are saying, oh, I won't be able to remember anything. And then you start to just jog their memory, and they went, oh yes, and I said this, and suddenly I had dialogue, and suddenly it was becoming a more in-depth comic. And you can see here I've got a rough map that I was able to start to kind of like just piece things together. And this is when I started to really understand what was happening, where the worlds between, or the veil between our worlds was at its thinnest. And there was places that I didn't realize Dan was in the room, and I kind of like suddenly understood kind of like what he was experiencing as well. So I created a lexicon of characters, and I think I'm gonna have to rush the next bit of my talk. But I created a lexicon of characters so I could really, I dissected every little bit so I could properly see it and understand it. So I had a character for death, which is the crow. I had a character for infection, which is the serpent, that was inspired by the Ouroboros, which was about life, death, and rebirth. But this infection wasn't about rebirth, it was about death. The seagulls are pain, because the morning that I became really, really ill, it was very rapid. My pain went from 0 to off the chart in a couple of hours. There were seagulls circling outside my window, and I was joking that this was a portent of doom, sort of on my phone tweeting that the pain in my neck had become a pain in the ass. And then it's like, and then I stopped joking quite soon after that. But the seagulls and the sound and the cacophony of sound sort of represents the pain. I actually think I went through the sound barrier in terms of pain, though. And then the coma itself, I drew as this creature, this blue creature with hospital doors as a head. It looks strong. It's kind of like, it's very kind of like, it's very kind of like well built, but it's got these really, really delicate legs. So it is this elegant creature that sort of I'm traveling in the body of, but it's also incredibly vulnerable too. I'm in a vulnerable space as well as a seemingly safe space. I was able to look at my fear, and the first week, it was about fear for myself, which I represented with a hare, a prey animal. And then in the second week, after my children came to visit me at a really critical point, and they absolutely broke through. My smallest child touched me, and I actually was absolutely in the room. I could hear them before I heard them, and then and my maternal spirit, it was the fear for them, and it was a vixen. And the reason it's a vixen, because when I first became a parent, and I was carrying this tiny child out, I was like going, why am I taking this most precious thing out into the world? I can't believe it. I was like so nervous about everything and so protective. And I imagined myself as a vixen. And the vixen came back then. I have to say, I haven't put the slides on here for time. I also had broke up time as well. I got to understand time. So there was my childhood self. There was recent time, which had been the previous 3 months, and then there was the present, and they all created this soup of experience. So before I started, I started with what I knew, and I knew I'd had these hallucinations. What I didn't realize is that they were connected to underworld myth, which actually started to blow my mind a little bit. I was like, wow, that's incredible. So it was underworld myth that related to Norse myth and the goddess Hel, who greets the old and the infirm in the afterlife. And she has a face that's half alive and half skull. And early on in my experience, I was greeted with my medics that had these features. And this is when I absolutely, excuse the language, I totally lost my shit. I was really, really scared. And halfway through, I found myself wandering along a dock. And I knew I was in China, but 3 months earlier, I'd been in Chinatown in Liverpool doing research for a comic, so it's sort of like it's pretty much implanted there. But then I wandered along, and I was on the edge of a feather over a body of water. And the feather I was balancing there relates to Egyptian myth. And I was being judged, and I knew I was being judged, and I could hear all the voices in the wind, and they were whispering around me, and they were concluding that I was going to live, and they judged that I would live. And I knew it was a judgment because I had been experiencing shame and guilt throughout. And I didn't quite understand why I was experiencing the shame and guilt. Or I did, but I didn't quite know until later why I was doing that. So I was on the edge of a feather being judged, and I realized that I didn't know that I was going to die. So I was a really arrogant human. I hadn't actually sort of like thought about my mortality, despite the medieval skeletons and everything. But also there was, again, Chinese myth. So when I woke up, I was spinning, and that relates to the wheel of life. And this is a real kind of like physiological experience. I spoke to somebody else who had a similar experience, so really sort of optical, but definitely was spinning. And I couldn't break through the surface until I actually had admitted a guilt. There was no way I could break through without doing that. So what I discovered once the book was in my hands, which was the biggest revelation, oh no, there was quite a few throughout, which was the whole point of it. I'd sort of like thought that my shame and guilt was self-questioning of like, what have I done to get myself here? What could I have possibly done to have deserved this kind of like awful experience of kind of like fear and shame and pain? When I was looking at the book, I kind of like realized that I just absorbed everybody's emotions, everything that was happening in the room, not just the sound, but how people were responding. And I had an out-of-body experience. There was a figure that was bleeding out, I think in my sort of like second day in hospital. So I'd had some debridement surgery, and it was only when I was literally dying again that they were like, oh, we have to go back in and we have to sort of like amputate. But I was looking at this figure bleeding out, and I thought, this is a person I'd shot, that I'd killed her. And she was a pregnant mother, so I'd not just killed her, I'd killed her children. She wasn't pregnant with one child, she was pregnant with 2 children. And now I kind of like know that actually I was looking at myself, and it was tied to the questions of when you go in and you're a woman of a certain age and you're asked, could you be pregnant? And it's incredible how it sort of like seeps in, because I wasn't actually present in the room when somebody's asking me that question. They think I'm present in the room, but I'm actually not, but I'm absorbing it. So I'm seeing this figure that's bleeding out, and I know I'm at the center of this, and I'm the cause of this. I don't realize it's me that everybody's sort of like panicking about or freaking out about. So there's a lot going on in Coma. So I drew a map, because I absolutely love maps. And this is comes back to the medieval, and this is based on Dante's map of purgatory. So it starts at the bottom, and it's the layers, and it circles up to the top, and the kind of like the wheel of life and wakefulness. And I label everything that goes through that. I was going to sort of like talk about sort of like the things that have come out, the things I've learned, but the things I've been able to share. But I'm going to move on to the next project, because I haven't been timing myself, and I don't know how I'm doing for time. So I've got 10 minutes left. Oh my word. Okay, I'm not going to talk about. Okay. Okay, right, I'm just going to have a big gulp of water. Excuse me, everybody. I was going to give you loads of details about Canterbury, but I'm going to scoot through those. That's my water bottle, apologies. Right, and I was going to read big reams, but I'm not going to do that either. Okay, quickly going to move on. So I'm going to talk could you tell me when I'm 5 minutes?
So, tell you in 5 minutes.
Yeah, because then I've got another thing to talk about.
Will I give you 7 and 5, or do you want just 5? 5, 3, and 1.
Give me 3, and then give me 5, and then I'm going to shut up now so I can actually do it. Okay, so moving on from Coma, and I just want to say, like, if anybody has got questions about Coma, please come up. I'd love to talk about it. I could talk about it all day, but I can only talk about it for 10 minutes. So after Coma, I was invited to work on the graphic, on the Canterbury Cathedral Miracle Windows graphic novel project. So this was part of a larger project called the Canterbury Journey. And it was 3 programs, and it was about heritage, which was about repair, restoration, and conservation. This is about kind of like repairing the fabric of this building. It was about visitor experience and the relationship, the connection with the collection site, and it was about engaging with local communities. So Canterbury Cathedral, for those that don't know, is in Canterbury, in Kent, in the UK. There's been a sort of religious kind of like building on this site since Roman times, and it was St. Augustine came and created an abbey in, I'm not going to tell you all of this. Anyway, it's the seat of the Archbishop of Canterbury of the Anglican Communion. Okay, it's been around a long time. So the miracle windows are about Thomas Becket. Also, this is a really early graphic medicine, and it's kind of like key to the survival and the expansion of Canterbury Cathedral. So graphic medicine is absolutely key to this building. So Thomas Becket, I'm going to really run through this. He was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. He was martyred in 1170. After his martyrdom, cures and miracles were attributed to him, and he was canonized in 1173. And Canterbury became a place of pilgrimage, and stories of healing were shared. And they were collected by 2 monks. And those stories of healing were then told directly to glaziers who told those stories in stained glass. And of course, with pilgrimage, this is kind of like the building had to expand to cater for not only taking care of people, but all the people come for pilgrimage. So the image at the bottom is some of the original stained glass. Not all of the glass, the individual pieces of glass in the miracle windows is original. Some of it's Victorian, but definitely the green horse at the back is the original glass. And this is displayed in the Trinity Chapel in Canterbury Cathedral, which is absolutely astonishing. So originally, the whole of the building would have been painted. So there's sort of narration and sequential art just covering this building, and then only fragments of it remain. So people would have come through the martyrdom and come on the hands and knees and up the steps, and they'd have come to Thomas à Becket's shrine and put their heads through a hole and kissed his casket, hoping for a cure. And it costs money to cater for people. So I just want to point out this little, so that's the shrine at the bottom with the little holes that people would have put their heads in. And the little green box is where people would have put their contributions and paid, which would have supported feeding them as they came for healing, but also, again, the expansion because of the growing numbers of visitors. So this is the work by Carrie Fransman. She was telling the story of the two sisters of Boxley. So not only was I comic artist, I was also a workshop lead, and I was the disability consultant. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but we were having lots of conversations around disability and actually telling these stories, because we had to stick to the stories, and it was really difficult, kind of like, because some of the attitudes still hold today, but there's kind of like, it's really kind of like quite harsh how people can like judged some of the characters in these stories. And people would blame themselves for their ongoing disability. So we had to sort of address that in how we told these stories. I'm not going to go into detail about my story too much, but my story that I worked on was about Elwood of Westering, who was unfairly judged, and he was severely punished for a crime he hadn't committed, and he was blinded and castrated. This is the glass of him being blinded and castrated. But he was cured by Thomas à Becket. And believe it or not, his testicles grew back and his eyesight came. Because he was visited in a dream by Thomas à Becket. And so he kind of like went on pilgrimage to Canterbury, telling his story, inviting people to touch the elements that had grown back. And people would give him money, and he would then give the money to other people, disabled people. What's incredible about these stories is that they are stories about people with chronic illness and disability and mental health issues. Really want to just say this, like, I was really privileged that there was a scholar there at the time I was sort of like doing this work, and you can't really see it, but the cap on the judge, I want to go back to mark making. It's the most beautiful mark making. I got to see this actually close up. Literally, my head was a few inches from it. You wouldn't see it from looking up to the windows. You wouldn't see it online, but they were out of the window for study. And there's beautiful mark making that told us that there was fur. His cap was made of fur. We gave voice to peripheral characters and their role in his story. I'm going to quickly move on. We definitely gave voice to women in these stories. And I could talk about brace and hose. Wonderful. I had to do lots of research about the clothing. How many minutes have I got?
Just around 5 minutes.
Hey, amazing. My work in progress at the moment is called Sereni's Progress, and I'm working with a writer called Gregory Normington, who teaches creative writing at Manchester Met, and he introduced a green writing module there, so about environmental writing. And he's part of Writing Rebellion, which is the writing wing of Extinction Rebellion. And this is an old story. It's an old eco-fable. It's about the relationship between us and the natural world. And it's told in a time when there was a changing relationship with the natural world. It was a time when kings and tribes fought over land and cattle, and when the influence of the early Christian church came and just was sort of changing the narrative around the environment, and actually was procuring land for churches because it was God's land. So they weren't going to fight for that land. They were just going to have that land. Thank you. It centers on two characters. I'm not even reading my notes anymore. Two characters, Sweeney and Ronan Finn. Sweeney is the sort of like brute of a character. He's a sort of like, he doesn't hold Christian beliefs. He doesn't hold the Sabbath. And Ronan wants him as a prize for the Christian church. I'm going to kind of like talk about the curse in a minute, but there's a curse in this story. I kind of like, in creating the story worlds, I have like somebody writes something down on a piece of paper going, and Ronan Finn reads a Psalter, and like, what does a Psalter look like? You know, this is set in the 7th century, and like going, I don't even know what a Psalter looked like in the 7th century. I'm going to go back even further. So this is a Psalter from the 6th century, and I'm going to try and, sorry, apologies for any people Irish, I'm going to sort of like butcher the pronunciation. This is the Colloch of Colum Kile. So this is the Psalter is contained within it. Well, it's actually, the Psalter is called the Colloch of Colum Kile. And it's a vellum manuscript. They're sleeves of paper decorated, and they would be bound in leather, loosely bound in leather, inside a wooden box and inside a shrine casket. So I've given Ronan a kind of like a rudimentary sort of like shrine casket. I'm sure he wouldn't have had one quite as elaborate as this, but he may well have done. We wanted to kind of like tie this story, make it sort of about the celebration of the book, and our sort of like visual reference is the Book of Zara and the Book of Kells and later the Lindisfarne Gospels. And I can talk to you all about that at the later stage. I've got 3 minutes. I've had the privilege of talking to Maeve Murphy from the Royal Irish Academy about how people kind of like travelled along the land, how they ate when they travelled. So this is Sweeney and his brother and the tribe going towards the Battle of Mora. You have to watch when somebody puts in a shield wall. I'm going to just quickly show this in a minute. Thank you, Chloe, for my little buckler. So I kind of like, I'm an avid fan of Vikings and Game of Thrones, so I was watching an awful lot of fighting videos and things, and it's like, that I'm like, drew panels with shields and shield walls, and then no, they didn't have big shield walls. Back to our beautiful source material and the Book of Kells, they had bucklers, which were not such defensive tools, but they were attacking tools. So, and they would have been held at the side. So when you're creating a story world, this is kind of like somebody can literally just write something and you're going, okay, I've got to go back to the sources. Because we want to kind of like be able to, this is myth, but it's also told at a specific time. And I want to respect that time. I had to kind of like, I have to look at the landscape, the fauna and flora that was in 7th century Ireland. I have to look at the orientation of the sun and how the shadows are cast, because some of these features still exist, and somebody out there knows if I get it wrong. And I go back to kind of like my methods of working, wet on wet, wet on dry, to create these atmospheric effects. And then it's about shape. So this is Sweeney pre-curse, and this is Ronan in the middle, who's kind of like thinking about kind of like the prize that he's going to get with Sweeney. But Sweeney doesn't play by the rules, so Ronan curses him instead. So again, I'm thinking about the shape of Sweeney. Early on, it talks about Ronan declares that animals don't have a soul, so they're not considered to be respected. And he kind of like curses Sweeney to become half human, half bird. So he's not fully human. He doesn't fully have a soul. And I'm thinking about the shape of this person who's just been cursed with these huge wings. His body is just suddenly changed shape. I had to come to terms with my changed shape and how that moves. I have 1 minute. So I look for reference, and I go to ballet dancers. I look at crows flying. I look at monkeys gabbling about. And I'm looking at everywhere for kind of like shapes to tell his story. And color. Color plays a huge part in what I'm doing. I had a massive aversion to green. I couldn't understand why I couldn't put green in. But this is early spring, and I had to slowly introduce green. Red, I love red. And you can see that I start with vermilion red. but it takes on a different meaning on a battlefield. It's a different meaning on a sunset. And I did slowly introduce green, because I also think graphic narratives are theatre. We want to kind of like have that punch, the turn of the page that just hits us, gives us a wallop. And suddenly I've overcome my aversion to green. This is about the wild world, and Sweeney finding his humanity in the wild world. And this is Sweeney's Lament. I'm not going to read it now, but it's a beautiful poem, and you're all been sort of like, don't have to hear me trying to speak a poem in a poetic way. I'll save you from that. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Zara. I'm in constant awe of Zara's drawing abilities and graphic expertise. It's amazing. I'm told that we need to stick to schedule, so unfortunately we have no time for questions now. But would you be okay, Zara, people approaching you during the day and asking?
No, please
I'm sure
do. I'd love to. And I'd
lots
love
of
to